Hello there, I'm Dr. Tyler Desplender, and this is my book, Foundations of Strongman Training. I've used my scientific training to perform brand new research studies on the sport of strongman and combined it with over a decade of personal experience competing in strongman and powerlifting to teach you how to train like the strongest people on earth. I've decided to make a video series on the content of the book. I'm going to share with you everything from how the book idea came to be to practical considerations for the insights gained from these scientific studies. By the end of this video series, you'll have the information you need to optimize your strongman training. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Foundations of Strongman Training. Today, we're on episode 4. If you missed the previous episode, please go watch it. I gave a brief history of the sport of strongman, and I also discussed 5 of the major challenges that I see in the sport. One of those that I want to dive into today with the study I did in chapter 2 of the book was focused on what's the actual skill set for strongman athletes. So, in the previous episode, in chapter 1 of the book, I kind of speculated about the size of that skill set, and I, speculate that it's actually massive, especially compared to other strength sports like powerlifting or weightlifting. But I don't want to stop there. I wanted to know exactly what are the skills that strongman athletes need to master, how many of them are, and what are they? And so what I did in chapter 2 of the book was I created a study that was focused on answering that question. And so today in this episode, I want to take you through that study. So let's get after it. Okay, so let me describe the study for you before we get into the juicy details, the results I know that you guys are all looking forward to. So this study started out for me in about 2016. I decided that I had this question: which strongman skills should an athlete master? And I wanted to do a study, collect some data and process that data and determine, a good answer for that using scientific methods. So that's what I did. I chose to do a retrospective study on competition data from strongman contests. So at the time there was no public databases where I could go and get this data from. I knew I had to collect it all by hand, so that was fine. So I started with what I knew best, and I collected data from my home province of Ontario, Canada. What I did was I gathered data from any competition that occurred in Ontario that offered spots for amateur athletes. So why I say that is because I included pro-am shows. In case you don't know what those are competitions where professional athletes and amateur athletes compete together. So in Ontario, we used to have at least a couple per year. One famous one, Ontario Strongest Man. Sadly, it doesn't happen anymore. But that was one that I included because amateur athletes were allowed to compete. So that was my criteria, is it just had to, offer spots to amateur athletes. And most of the contests were all for amateur athletes anyways. So what I did was I took data from those contests for amateur athletes across the time period of 2015 to 2019. So I started the study in 2016. And so I collected the data from the year before, 2016, and then I collected it each year until 2019. So it took me, 4 years to collect 5 years worth of data. So that's kind of the scope of the data. Now, at the end, I found 117 contests. There was roughly 20, low 20s number of contests per year, which is pretty good. I think it means that athletes will have a chance in Ontario to compete in at least a couple contests per year in their region. Ontario is pretty big, so it's actually, I think, was a pretty good sign of the sport, and I think it's probably only increased since then. So great sign. Anyways, I found 117 contests. I think 5 of those didn't have sufficient data, so that means that the event descriptions, I couldn't discern exactly the details I wanted from those descriptions. So I didn't use 5 of them. And then one of them got canceled. So in the end, I was left with 111 sets of competition data. And what that data was basically the descriptions of the events. And if you've ever looked at strongman event descriptions, especially when contests get announced, and we're talking 10 years ago or so, descriptions were minimal, right? So you might see things like max deadlift, keg toss, and it's like there's no details other than that. You don't know what height you're throwing the keg to. You don't know what apparatus you're lifting for max deadlift. So that's the kind of data that I was able to get. Now, some promoters and event descriptions had much more data, right? So they'll give you like the weights you're going to use, distances, might give you time limits for each event. So there's kind of a range of what that data might look like. But in the end, I had 111 of these contest event descriptions. So from these contest event descriptions, my job was to pull skills out of them. And I want to make a few points here about why I am differentiating between events and skills. First of all, we should describe again here what I'm considering as a skill. In this data, there is no description of the effort patterns. So you might have like max deadlift. That one actually might tell you what the effort pattern is. It's a 1 repetition maximum. But most of the time, you'll just have something like car deadlift. And you won't know, are you going to, deadlift it and hold it? Are you going to do it for repetitions? Is it going to be like rising weights? You don't know anything about the effort pattern part. So in order to simplify things, and obviously there would be many cases where I didn't actually have the data and I couldn't infer it well, I made the definition for this study of a skill the combination of a motion pattern and an implement. So what that means is if a contest had a barbell deadlift and one had an axle deadlift, those would count as 2 separate skills. So it's the combination of the motion pattern, in this case would be the deadlift for both, but the implement is different. And so that's a pretty common, way of approaching this in the sport. There's a big carryover, obviously, between axle deadlift and barbell deadlift, but they're different enough, or between a barbell deadlift and a car deadlift, that we, separate those things and we practice them differently. So that's what I did in this data set. So just to reiterate here, a skill is a motion pattern plus an implement, and it should be plus an effort pattern, but because that data wasn't available, I didn't consider it here in the study. Now, for each of these event descriptions, my job was to pull out all of the individual skills. And for each skill, I basically add a tally under that skill name, and I call it an occurrence count. So it's just like that skill occurred at a contest somewhere in this data set. That's important because the occurrence counts are, for this study and the next ones, basically how I perform some of the analysis. Okay, so let's get into an event. Why I keep separating event and skill here is because an event could actually consist of multiple skills, and each of those skills should be tallied separately. And that's how that's the approach I took in the study, was to separating them. So for example, if we have a medley and it has a yoke walk and a log press, then those are 2 different skills, right? The motion patterns are different and the implements are different. Then we would have an occurrence of 2 different skills, one for the yoke walk and one for the log press in that example. Every medley that I came across in this data set, I split it up in that way. So you can imagine some medleys will, have one event because someone called it a medley, and you might be like lifting multiple barbell deadlifts, right? But because the motion pattern and the implement are the same, it's just a single skill. Some other medleys might have 4 different skills in them. And so I thought it was important to break those up, because you, as an athlete, will need to train each of those skills individually. And so it's important that they're, I think, tallied separately. Okay, another point is that some of the events I wasn't able to break down. I'll give you one example, and I think this is the kind of only example of this in the data set. Some promoters put on their event description object loading race, but they did not list what the objects were. Some promoters did. They'll have like a object loading race, and they'll say, it's like a fire hydrant and then a tire and then a stone or something like that. And so you can, because you know that there's different implements and each one's a load or a carry, whatever it might be, you can split those into the individual skills. Some promoters just put object loading race, gave you some parameters like a time limit or something, and you had no idea what the actual implements were. So unfortunately for those cases, I had to just count that as a single skill because there was no way for me to decompose it into what the actual individual skills were. But based on the data I had, that's the decision I had to make in this analysis. After I did all this processing and I took all the event descriptions and I turned them into a set of skills, essentially what I had was a list of all the unique skills, right? So if I had different competitions and they used the same event, then those aren't unique, right? Those just get tallied up together. But in the end, I would have this set of unique skills, and I would also have the occurrence counts. So for each skill, how many times did it occur in the data set? So that means across the whole 5 year period. So it could happen like once in that 5 year period. It could happen every year. It could happen multiple times every year. But that's a kind of data set that I took away from doing this analysis on the competition data for amateur athletes in Ontario. Okay, before we get into the results, I got one more thing to mention here. I kind of mentioned in the previous episode that there was that the skill set is so big that it will probably take a huge data set in order to perform inferential statistics and draw any like significant conclusions about the data. That's because if we compare between each individual skill, there is a ton of different categories to compare for. And every time you add more numbers of categories to compare, the sample size you need grows and grows really huge. And I just knew looking at the data set, like, okay, I collected, I think, a data set large enough, like, than what I saw in the literature. But I still, from my experience as a scientist, had this feeling that I don't think the power of this sample size is there yet to compare between all of the classes that I was seeing in the data. But that didn't stop me. So I couldn't do inferential statistics. That's fine. I can still learn something about this by taking some descriptive statistics, which, if you don't know what that is basically just looking at the averages and trends in the data. So that's what I did for this study. In the later studies, I found ways, which we'll get into in the next episodes, of how to do some inferential statistics and come away with some cool conclusions there. But for this one, just descriptive statistics. So we're talking about like averages or trends, things like that. So basically, I decided, okay, I'm going to just stick to that. I'm going to look at what the data tells me. And I had these three kind of questions in mind. One was the fundamental question. So, which strongman skills should an athlete master? So that one was pretty easy. After I decomposed the data, I had the list of unique strongman skills and what their names are. And I knew from my experience what they entailed for athletes to do. So, but that was the first question. Number two was, what was the average number of skills per contest? So if I'm going to go into any contest, how many skills should I train, regardless of what the skills actually are? And I think that's important to know because of the uncertainty principle, which I talked about in the last episode in Strongman. So just to recap there, you don't always know what the skills are going to be or the events. Promoters, for different reasons, don't release those like ahead of time. And so that makes it very difficult. So it's good to know, on average, how many skills will I be tested on? So even if I don't know what the skills are, I can still make sure that I have some training dedicated to where I'm hitting that average number of skills in a single session so that I mimic the demands of competition. So that was the second skill. What's that average number? And then the last question was, what strongman skills, if any, I thought there'd be some, but I'll add this, if any, are contested every year? Because if you have a skill that's occurring every year in a sport with such variation across this 5-year period, those are probably fundamental skills. Because especially if they occur multiple times in every year, my argument is that those are kind of foundational, and you should be training those skills all the time. Those should be your bread and butter. And so that was the last question, kind of seeing if there's any of those skills. And then that would give us the insight about like, what's my baseline skill set that I need to have. Okay, so for our first question here, which strongman skills must an athlete master? I found that there were 74 unique skills that these amateur competitors could have been tested on. So, like, if they competed in every contest in that data set, which, nobody did, probably nobody would want to. But if they did, then they would have to prepare for 74 unique skills. And just remember here, the skill is simply just the motion pattern plus implement. And we haven't added the effort pattern in for reasons I described previously. I'll show you here now. This is actually figure 4 from Foundations of Strongman Training. Here's all the skills, all 74 of them, and their occurrence counts. I won't go through them all here. Pause the video, take a look if you want, or pick up a copy of Foundations of Strongman Training. You can take a look. They're also described in Appendix A, where I lay out the skill names, and then I give a description, what's the athlete supposed to do for each skill. So if you're really curious about that details, pick up a copy of the book, check it out. So you see this figure here. Let's talk about a few of these. So at the top, you could see that there's the top 3 skills, somebody might want to know. In order are log press, farmer's walk, and yoke walk. So my question to you is, does that fit with your experience? Let me know in the comments. Maybe you see some other skills that you're always tested on other than these 3. This fits with my experience, by the way. I don't know how many first places I've lost because my grip sucks and therefore my farmer's walk is terrible. But I'd love to hear if you've had a different experience. Let me know. Okay, at the other end of the spectrum here, so that was top 3. At the lower end, you could see that 22 of the skills were only tested one time in 5 years. So hopefully that emphasizes the variability. Now it's probably, not worth it to spend a ton of time on those 22 skills that were only tested once in a 5-year period. It means that the likelihood of them coming up again is very low. Instead, a better approach would probably be to forego those, or maybe, here and there pepper them into your training. Or if you know the contest details, that one skill is coming up, then you train it for sure. But those bottom 22 skills that are only tested one time, they're probably things you can just kind of put less resources in, let's say it that way. Okay, moving on here. 51 of the skills were tested less than 5 times in 5 years, which means that there was some years they weren't tested in. So that just shows you that, again, the variability. 51 out of 74. So a huge percentage of these aren't tested every year, right? So, something to think about is like, when's the last time you did a phone book tear in a strongman contest or an anvil deadlift, right? So cool events, but they don't come up too often. They don't come up every year. So maybe you spend a bit more resources on those that happen, almost every year. But I wouldn't say as much as our last category, which we'll get to in a minute here. One thing to keep in mind here is I've given you the set. Here's 74 unique skills that amateurs had to, be tested on if they competed in this region and time period, but it's not all the skills, right? There's lots of skills that maybe didn't happen in this region. There's, skills that there's like implements that maybe only are built for professional athletes because of, say money, financial considerations, things like that. And so I just want to keep that in mind here, that it's not all of the skill set, all of the skills that will be in the, global skill set, but it's a first glimpse. I haven't seen anything like this in the literature that attempted to lay out what are all the skills. And so anyways, there it is. Take it or leave it. All right, let's move on to our next question here, which was, what's the average number of skills per contest? So if I looked at the occurrence count data for the contest, took the average number and the standard deviation, want to see how much variability there is, that number was 5 on average, plus or minus 2 skills. So that means from the majority of the competitions, they fall anywhere in between 3 and 7 skills tested at a contest. Now, my advice would be to hit the upper end of those, or at least the average, because, most shows, at least for amateurs, are 4 or 5 events. Even if they're 4 events, often one of those events involves 2 different skills. It's usually a medley, right? So you'll probably do like a carry medley where there's like 2 things, like a yoke and a sandbag, something like that, a farmer's walk, and then, a yoke walk. So in my experience, even if it's only 4 events, there's usually 5 skills. And then some contests are 5 or 6 events. So basically, this is showing that on average, you're going to have 5 skills per contest. And that means that you better train for that. So when you do contest simulations in your training, you better have some of those be with 5 skills. Now, some advice here, obviously, when you're doing 5 skills heavy in one training session, you're not going to have a ton of volume. You're probably not going to get to contest weights either. That's probably not going to be fruitful. But you're still going to want to train those 5 skills, right? And make sure that like the timing between those skills kind of mimics the contest, things like that. Now, what I did was I also looked at what was the average number of skills per contest in each year that the data was collected. So here you see, this is figure 5 from the book. When you look across each year, there's not much variation here, right? So you see the average stays relatively consistent. So the conclusion here is that you better get ready for 5 skills per contest or more, right? If you get ready for 5, 6, 7, and then your contest has 3, no problem. You're more than prepared, right? That'll be half of the capacity that you're trained for. So anyways, that's that question. The average number of skills per contest is 5. All right, moving on to the final question of the study here. What skills are tested every year? Or as I mentioned, what foundational skills do we have? If you look at the data, only 23 of those 74 skills were tested 5 or more times, which means only 23 of them are candidates for this. Because we have 5 years, you have to test them at least once per year to be considered here. In the end, though, only 14 of these skills were tested in all 5 years. And I'll show you here, this is a table from the book here, table 3. They are log press, farmer's walk, yoke walk, vehicle deadlift. I say vehicle deadlift here because could be a car, could be a truck, could be an ATV, could be whatever, could be just plates and people. But you get the concept. It's a lever deadlift, typically of the vehicle. Circus dumbbell, Atlas stone load, axle press, tire flip, vehicle pull, axle deadlift, barbell deadlift, frame carry, keg toss, field stone load. So those are the 14 skills that were tested every year in this data set. And each of those skills were tested 2 or more times in each year, which adds to their efficacy as being foundational skills, with the exception of keg toss in 2019, which was only tested once in that year. A little caveat there is around that time is when sandbag toss was really starting to take off with the sport. We had a couple of years where the pros were using sandbags and companies were refining their models, right? So like Rogue and Cerberus were kind of pushing the envelope there. And so that year we actually saw an uptick in sandbag toss events, with the keg toss kind of falling by the wayside there in 2019. But that still means that explosive overhead throw movement is a foundational skill. Just to put this in perspective, if you master these 14 skills, you would have accounted for 71% of all the skill occurrences in this data set. So just these 14 skills, you would have been prepared for 71% of the things that you could have seen when going to any one of these contests. In my mind, that's pretty substantial. And it actually gives, I think, athletes a place of focus. It gave me a place of focus when I first discovered this. It's like, at least in this study, there's 74 things I might need to consider. But if I just break that down to the foundational skills, 14 of them, I can focus on those, and 70% of the time I'll be prepared for whatever's thrown at me. And so I think that's really helpful, especially for strongman with the uncertainty that is in the sport. All right. So I hope you enjoyed the insights to those studies. I hope you found them useful. I know I did when I first learned this. It really helped me to focus in some of the things in my training, make sure I'm training the right skills, especially in the off season, those foundational skills, making sure I'm having training sessions with, 5 skills per session when I'm trying to do kind of contest simulation, things like that. So I hope you found those useful as well. But look, this is just one sample in time that I've taken. If your experience has been different, let me know in the comments. Would love to hear about it. That way, when I do the next study, I'll be able to account for some of those things that I might have missed with this one. Like any good scientist, we can't just talk about the good here. We should also talk about limitations of the study. There's 3, kind of general ones I want to highlight here. First is these insights are descriptive, not inferential, which I kind of discussed at the, earlier in this episode. What that means is we're just looking at the average of, the occurrence counts, for example, in this data set, but we didn't do any inferential statistics. So that means we technically can't take these averages and say that they'll represent some other sample of strongman contest. So just keep that in mind. Now, in my experience, if I pair my experience with the results, I'd say it does match my experience, and my experience extends beyond this time frame, right? I've been competing since 2013, and I've competed in other places than Ontario, and so I think that it fits pretty well, but it is a limitation. I hope in the future, I'll be able to get a much bigger sample size, and maybe we'll be able to do some inferential statistics. That would be awesome. But for now, that's a limitation. Take it for what it is. Treat these things like guidelines, and obviously individualize as you need. Okay, the second limitation here is that the skill set, and I mentioned this before, doesn't have all of the skills in it. And it also doesn't account for new ones, right? I just gave you a snapshot in time. There's going to be new implements that come out all the time, all right? And also implements are not standardized, right? So for example, 2 sets of farmer's walk handles could be drastically different, right? Some handles have knurling on them. Some are like slippery ass paint that you can barely hold on to, right? And they're also going to change as well. And those details, especially about the implements, are not available in the event descriptions. So they're not really like something that I can factor into the skills. That's why when I said it was the skill is the pairing of motion pattern and implement, the implement is like kind of a general idea, right? 2 barbells are different, 2 axles are different from each other, but you're not able to know exactly or categorize that easily. So that's why the skill set is kind of like limited here. In addition, effort patterns weren't there. The data wasn't there. So that portion is not included in this. And that brings us to the third limitation, which is that the data set itself is limited. So we only have amateur data. We only have data from Ontario, right? And we only have data from 2015 to 2019. And so there's going to be, events that occur, skills that are tested that just didn't fall into that data set. One example is professional athletes. They are tested on the Wheel of Pain. I don't think I've seen any amateur contests in Ontario 2015 to 2019 that had the Wheel of Pain. And I think that's because it wasn't even created yet. Maybe it was created around 2019 or so. So that's just something to keep in mind there, that the data set doesn't contain everything. And so, that's good though for follow-up studies. And that's what I hope to do in the future, and maybe gain some better insights, and be exciting to look back and see, do the conclusions of this study still hold when you have a much larger data set or not? So that's exciting for me, hopefully exciting for you, and that'll be nice to figure out in the future. All right. In conclusion, here, despite these limitations, I think that the results still provide a nice set of guidelines for athletes. So we learned, like, here is a skill set, right? There's 74 unique amateur skills there. We also learned that on average, you're tested at 5 skills per contest. So you better make sure you have some training sessions where you have 5 skills when you're trying to simulate contests. And then we took a look and we found that based on the occurrence counts, that 14 of those skills are fundamental skills. So they happen multiple times every year. And so those are the ones that you should focus your time on. Like I said, you'd cover about 71% of the total occurrence count of skills with just training those 14 foundational skills. Again, I mentioned the limitations, but right now, this is the only study I know that's kind of looked into these things, and it's all we have to go off right now. So that's what I've been using to drive my training and anyone I work with. That's all we have until new data comes out. I hope I'm able to give you some new data, but that means new studies, that means more data, and that takes time. So bear with me, and hopefully in the future I'll have some better answers for you. All right. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, comments, leave them for me. I'd love to hear about your experiences. Does this study match what you've experienced? Or are you finding that you're tested on a whole bunch of different skills that weren't considered in the study, that weren't part of the data set? Let me know. I'd love to hear about it. Now, next episode, we're going to be diving into another study to try to answer the second foundational question here, which was, what's the distribution of motion patterns in strongmen? So, here I talked about how a skill is that combination of motion pattern and implement. So the next study, I wanted to take the results from this one and dive a bit deeper. Each of those skills that we listed, 74, we can take the motion pattern of each one of those. So we have 74 motion patterns. But what's the distribution of them? Is there some way to condense that set into a smaller set and then analyze, kind of between motion patterns, understand how they're distributed so that we can prioritize skills? Here we talked about prioritizing the foundational skills, but in the next study, in the next episode, we'll talk about a different way for trying to prioritize based on motion patterns. All right. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.